Have you ever felt overwhelmed by all the different ways to invest in real estate? Rentals, flips, Airbnb, the BRRRR strategy? If so, this episode will make things clear. I'm going to explain every major real estate investing strategy in a simple and easy to understand way. And I'll help you choose the best strategy for your own journey towards financial freedom. If we haven't met yet, my name is Chad Carson. You can also call me Coach Carson. And on this channel, I teach you how to use real estate investing to achieve financial freedom so you can spend your time doing more of what matters. So imagine that your journey as a real estate investor is a lot like climbing a mountain. And the peak of that mountain is your goal, financial freedom. And it might mean a specific number like making $10,000 per month from your rental properties. But what it really means is that you have the time and the flexibility and the freedom to do whatever's most important to you. So that's the peak of the mountain. But if you're standing at the bottom of the mountain looking up, that can be really intimidating. How do you actually get up the mountain to your goal? And that's where strategies come in. The way I see strategies are a lot like routes up the mountain. And so just imagine you have other people who've gone before you, and maybe they've left footprints in the mountain. You can see kind of the path they went, and maybe they even left some ropes for you to hold on to. And so those strategies are ways that other people have gotten up the mountain. These are things like house hacking, long-term rentals, BRRRR strategy. I'm going to go into details about each one of these. But the mistake I see a lot of real estate investors make is they sort of jump around between different strategies. And what ends up happening is you slide right back down the mountain right where you started because you're not focusing on one or the other. And so there's one, maybe two strategies that probably makes the most sense for you where you are in your journey right now. And so that's what I want to help you do in this episode is find that strategy to focus on. But I want to mention one other thing that comes up in a lot of real estate investing education is this idea of tactics. Now, tactics are what we spend a lot of the time teaching in real estate investing. I know I do, and I really enjoy getting in the weeds. These are things like financing strategies, all the different ways you can finance your property, or it might even be different ways to buy properties at a discount, ways to send direct mail and get off-market properties. And all of these are really important. That's how you actually make money in real estate investing. But to go back to our climbing metaphor, these tactics are things like your pickaxe and your rope and your shoes, the ways you get up the mountain. But without a specific strategy, those tactics don't really make as much sense. You can spin your wheels, you can kind of start going in one direction up the mountain and then end up getting lost and not making it to the top. So this metaphor means if you start with a strategy and you get really clear there, everything else in the real estate investing space is going to make a lot more sense. One more thing before we get into the actual strategies is that I'm going to divide all of these strategies into three different stages as a real estate investor. The first is the starter phase when you're first doing your first deal or two. The second is the wealth builder phase when you're trying to grow from a little bit of money into a lot of money. And the third is the harvester phase when you're getting towards the end of your financial freedom journey, when you're trying to turn all the wealth you've accumulated into cash flow so you can actually live off of it and have time to do what matters. This is important because whether you're a starter, a builder, or a harvester, the strategy that makes the most sense for you is going to be very different depending on what stage you're in. So I'm going to begin with the starter strategies. And the very first strategy is so simple that a lot of people overlook it, but it's one of my favorite strategies. And it's simply this: to rent out the house that you already live in. I sometimes call this the live in, then rent strategy. And it's actually the one I began with almost 22 years ago. I moved into a house and I liked living there, but eventually I decided to buy another property. And instead of selling it, like a lot of people do after they own a house, I decided to keep it as a rental property. And now 22 years later, this property has at least doubled in value, probably more than that. And the rent that I collect has also doubled in value. So it's been a very good investment over those 22 years. And yet I got into it in a really simple way. And that's one of the benefits of this strategy. It's not fancy and you're not going buying a rental property, but you have to live somewhere. And if you just keep that property instead of selling it, you could build up a small, at least your first rental property, maybe you can do it a couple times. The other benefit is the financing. When you live in a house, it's the easiest way to get financing. There's often low down payment programs. You can get the lowest interest rate over 30 years. And so you can actually keep that financing once you move out. And I do want to mention a caveat, though, that you have to do this the right way and you have to do it according to the rules of your mortgage company. You can't just move into a property and say, I'm just going to rent it out right away. You actually have to have this be your residence. So plan on living there, make it a place that you want to live. The key here, though, is down the road, people do move. people move up, they buy a different property, move up to a more expensive property. So once it's time to move up, the point here is then you just keep it as a rental instead of selling it. The second strategy is another one of my favorites, and it's called house hacking. Now, let me define house hacking. It means living in a property, so similar to the first strategy, but the difference here is you're actually going to rent out part of the property that you live in. So this could happen a few different ways. You could live in a single family house and rent out the extra bedrooms to roommates. That's one possible way. Or if you didn't want to rent to roommates, you could live in a duplex, or you could live in a house that has an ADU, like an accessory dwelling unit or a guest house on the property. You could rent out that extra space. Or you could live in a small multifamily, like a 3-unit, a 4-unit, and rent out those extra spaces. The point is, the common theme is that you're living in one place and you're renting it out, and you're using that income to help you live for free, or maybe just reduce the cost of living there. And that's the beautiful part. I actually did this my second property. So I moved up from that first property I told you about. I moved into a 4-unit building. We fixed it up, and I lived in unit number 2, and I rented out unit number 1, 3, and 4. And I had enough rent coming in from that to cover all of my mortgage, my taxes, and my insurance. So I had to come out of pocket to pay for maintenance and utilities and things like that. But it was a beautiful place to be as a starter, because I was able to reduce my living expenses, and I used those extra savings to buy other properties that I wanted to invest in later on as rental properties. So it really helped me a lot. And another benefit of this is similar to strategy number 1, is that you get owner-occupant financing when you live in a house hack. So all of those low down payment programs, like the FHA with 3.5% down, the VA loan if you're a veteran, you can get a 0% down loan, or even just conventional loans. There's some 5% down payment loans, even for small multifamily properties. So if getting your down payment together as a starter is one of the biggest challenges, doing a house hack can be the best way to get into a property. And I love it because you're learning to be a landlord. You know, there's a lot of things to learn about how to manage a property and get the software and screen tenants and those sorts of things. And when you're living in the property, it's sort of like an apprenticeship. You can learn as you go, and you're going to make some mistakes. That's the natural way it happens. But when you're on site and you're living there, there's a little bit more forgiveness for those mistakes. You can talk to your tenants, you can learn from it. And then later on, if you decide to move up to a bigger house or something, you can keep the property and keep it as a rental. And so I still own my original 4-unit building. It's one of my favorite properties. And many, many years later, the rents have also gone up, the price has gone up, the debt has gone down, and it's still been a great investment that started as a house hack. The third strategy is also a strategy where you live in the property, but instead of renting it out, you're going to flip it. You're going to resell it and make a profit. We call this the live in, then flip. And one of the biggest benefits of this is it's a way to make some money on a property and not pay any taxes on it. So there's a section of the US tax code, if you want to nerd out on this, is section 121, that has an exemption where you don't have to pay taxes on it if you've lived in the property in 2 out of the last 5 years. So this strategy is moving into a property, typically one that needs a little bit of cosmetic work. It's dated, and you can either do some of the work yourself, or if you're like me and you're not that handy, you hire other people to do it, and you build some value, add some value to the property. So let's say you lived in it for 2 years, you did some fix-up work, and the net profit after you sold the property was $100,000. You did really, really well with that, and you sold it. That $100,000 can go in the bank. You can go in your bank account, or you can use it to buy another property, and you don't have to pay any taxes on that. And that's a huge, huge benefit, because I have friends, for example, Mindy and Carl Jensen. Mindy is actually the co-host of the Bigger Pockets Money podcast. They have done this over and over again. And starting with a small amount of money, small amount of down payment, they've built up hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars in equity just by repeating this process. But whether you want to do it one time or multiple times, you're taking advantage of an amazing part of the tax code. And if you feel like you're handy, or if you like this type of strategy, or maybe just rental properties don't make sense in your area, you're in high price areas, you can still flip the property, make some money, and still be investing in real estate. By the way, I'm going to be going through a lot of strategies in this episode. So if you want a cheat sheet, a written cheat sheet with a list of all the strategies and the details that I go over here, go to coachcarson.com/strategies. You can download a free workbook page that you can go along with the video, or use it as a review after you watch it. The fourth strategy is another one that's perfect for starters, and it's called the turnkey buy and hold rental property strategy. So this is one where you buy a property that's either brand new or has been fixed up or just doesn't need a lot of work, and you keep that as a rental property. So all of the other strategies we talked about, you're actually moving into the property. This is one that is a pure rental property. And I really like this one for people who are busy, who are high earners at their job, who don't have a lot of time to invest in real estate, but they still want to directly own real real estate, I recommend buying properties that are not major fixer-uppers. Fixer-uppers are great. I'm going to talk about that in future strategies, but they also have a lot of complications. I've seen a lot of people lose money from making mistakes with fixer-upper rental properties. So buying one that's more turnkey can still make you money in real estate. Now, the downside is often you have to make a bigger down payment, so you have more cash involved. So maybe you put 20 to 30% down, maybe more today with higher interest rates. Sometimes you have to put even bigger down payment in order to make that property cash flow. And you're not necessarily buying it at a steal of a deal, at the biggest discount possible, like you could with a value-add fixer-upper type rental. But if you're a busy professional and you can buy in the best locations, or maybe even a cash flow location where you can hold it, things can get better over time. You have the patience to sit with a property for 5 years, 10 years, 15 or 20 years. And that patience, I compare this to like planting a seed in a garden and watching a fruit tree grow. It takes a long time for a fruit tree to bear fruit, but if you're patient with the right locations in real estate, that rental that today was just sort of an okay investment that made a little bit of cash flow over time can make a lot more cash flow, and the price of that property can go up. Kind of like my first rental property that I bought and moved into 22 years ago. So long-term buy and hold, turnkey rentals could be a great strategy for those of you who want to get in the game, kind of dip your toes in it, or just those of you who don't want to have a busy second job. You just want to have some simple real estate investments. The fifth strategy, called wholesaling, is another one that could be good for some of you who are starting in real estate investing. Now, what does this mean? Wholesaling just means buying a property at a low price and reselling it a little bit higher to other investors. So instead of flipping houses, which I'll talk about more in the fix and flip strategy, you are buy low and sell a little bit higher. So you're a deal finder. You're finding deals that are maybe fixer-uppers, deals that could be flipped, could be rental properties. But instead of you buying and holding it yourself, you're quickly reselling it to somebody else. Now, the benefit of this is you can actually make quick profits without having to take the risk and the long-term hassle of owning these properties. So that's the benefit. Make some profit now, go on to the next deal. But there are some downsides, and this is actually touted as a big-time beginner strategy by a lot of real estate YouTubers. I don't think it's the best one for most people, for the main reason being this is a sales business. And many of you are not good salespeople. Let's just be honest. You have to be willing to go out and send a lot of marketing, talk to a lot of people, make a lot of offers, get rejected a lot. And that's not for everyone. That's not a good fit for everyone. A lot of you would be better off doing smaller number of deals and maybe buying properties from wholesalers instead of being the wholesaler yourself. But for some people, including myself, I actually got started in wholesaling when I got into real estate investing. It can still be a good fit. There's one other downside that's kind of materialized lately is there's also a lot of regulation around wholesaling. So certain states either make it really, really difficult, or you just have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to be able to wholesale. So you have to understand these regulations. Kind of trying to skirt around the regulations is not a good idea. So in some cases, you might have to get your real estate license. In other cases, you might have to just follow the rules and maybe buy the property first before you can actually sell it, or find other ways to still be able to do it legally. So all that being said, for some of you, could be a good strategy. I actually, if I had to do it all over again, instead of starting as a wholesaler, I probably would have gotten my real estate license and just tried to be a deal finder for other people and make bird dog finder's fees as a real estate licensee instead of just wholesaling. That's my take on it. So that's another option you could think about. But for those of you interested in wholesaling, definitely go down that rabbit hole and explore this strategy. Now that we've been through the first 5 strategies, which were all starter strategies for newer investors, I want to transition into the phase of wealth building, where you're trying to go from a small amount of wealth into a much larger amount of wealth. Maybe you have $100,000 now, you want to turn that into $1 million or $2 million so that eventually you can have financial freedom. And the first strategy I think of in this stage, strategy number 6, is called the fixer-upper rental property strategy. It also goes by other names like the value add strategy or the BRRRR strategy. But the common theme in all of these cases is that you're buying a property that needs work. There's something wrong with it. And when you fix that thing that's wrong, you increase the value of the property. Often you increase the rents for the property. And this is how you can really accelerate your wealth building journey. Instead of just waiting passively like we did in the turnkey rental property strategy for the property to go up in value over time, instead you force the appreciation, you do something to it in the next 3 to 6 months, and you can increase your wealth by $50,000, $100,000, even multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars with the right properties by using your sweat equity, your knowledge of the market, and forcing the appreciation of the property. Now, I want to talk about the BRRRR strategy, which is one variation of this because it's become pretty popular. And it was actually coined by my friend Brandon Turner back in the day, and it's become really popular. And it is a variation of the fixer-upper strategy that has to do with the financing. And it stands for buying, remodeling, renting it out, so you're getting it stabilized. Then you refinance it to hopefully pull out some or all of your money from the property. And then once you've got your money, you repeat and you do it again. Now, it's a great strategy. I've done some BRRRR strategies, and I know a lot of people who have, even today in 2025. It's become a little less easy to do as interest rates have gone up. And one of the reasons is the cost of financing has gone up. So that kind of limits how much you're able to borrow on a property and still have a positive cash flow. So in many cases, people are still having to leave more cash in the deal maybe than they did 5 or 6 years ago when interest rates were still low. That doesn't mean it's a bad strategy. This might mean it's a little bit more of a capital intensive strategy, having to leave more money in the deal. So, but in all of these cases, the big deal about fixer-upper rental property strategies is you're forcing that appreciation, you're forcing that equity, building some wealth quickly. The downside, though, is that there's more moving parts, that for the reward you get in increasing equity, you have more risk. There's more things that can go wrong. For example, you could be over budget on your remodel. I've seen this happen a lot, with myself included. And so what you thought was a $50,000 remodel could turn into a $75,000 remodel because you missed something. It's really easy to have that happen, and they can start eating up your equity or your profit that you thought you had. You can also have contractor issues. You could have issues with the timing of your refinance when you're trying to pull your money back out. So with so many moving parts, that can become risky, and you kind of lose control of certain parts of that process. So just know that going in. It's a little bit more of an advanced strategy. That's why I didn't put it in the beginner strategy. But so many real estate investors really accelerate their wealth building, myself included, by thinking about fixer-upper rental property strategies at some point in their career. Strategy number 7 is the fix and flip strategy. And it's actually very similar to strategy number 6 with fixer-upper rentals. The only difference is instead of fixing them up to keep, we're fixing them up to sell. And the big benefit of this is you can generate chunks of cash relatively quickly, like in 3 to 6 months, instead of waiting for the little trickles of cash flow you have month to month to month. And I actually did this with a business partner for many years in my own business. This is how I paid the bills. This is how I got money in order to reinvest it for more rental properties. We would buy these fixer-uppers and resell them. So a really big benefit, quick chunks of cash. The downside of that, though, is very similar to the downside of fixer-upper rentals. There's more moving parts. You could have some risk of the remodel going over budget, having problems with contractors, so you have to get good at that. The other risk with this is market timing. So by the time you buy a property, you got to sell it quickly because sometimes the market changes. I've seen people, myself included, where we bought properties, fixed them up, and by the time we went to put them on the market 3, 4, 5 months later, the market's changed and we can't sell it as easily, or maybe the price changed and we have to lower our price. So that's the downside. It could also go up. So you're out of control there. The market dictates a lot of what you're selling. So that's a risk you just have to be aware of. The other challenge is more about a business model challenge, that you're just buying and selling. And that's great to make cash flow, but having cash by itself doesn't build wealth. It could be a tool to build more wealth, but I have found buy and hold rental properties is where I've built most of my wealth. And when I start flipping houses and flipping houses and flipping houses, that money disappears to somewhere. Maybe it disappears into the next property and the next property, or it disappears into expenses personally that you spend. But when you have a rental property and you have the equity in the rental, it's kind of like on lock and key. You can't get that equity until one of these days in the future when you sell it. And so it keeps compounding and growing over time. I found that a lot of people flipping houses have the temptation to keep making short-term money instead of planting more seeds to buy long-term. And that leads me to one more downside on fix and flips. It's not as tax optimized as owning rental properties. Every time you sell a property, this is just a business. And so you have taxes, short-term taxes that you pay on those flips. And sometimes that's the highest tax rates you can get. Whereas if you keep a property and you hold it as a rental property, and let's say you sold it 5 or 10 years from now, you would have a long-term capital gain, which at least when I'm recording this in 2025 is a much lower tax rate than short-term taxes that you will pay on a flip. So if you want to grow, taxes are one of the frictions that keep you from growing your wealth as much. So in that way, rental properties and holding as many rental properties as you can will actually get you to your wealth building goal faster. Strategy number 8 is called short-term rentals, and this is simply defined as renting to people who stay in your property for less than 30 days. And this has become famous because of Airbnb. It's actually been around for a while, but Airbnb really opened up this market and expanded in a big way. And one of the biggest pluses as a real estate investor in using this strategy is that compared to long-term rentals, you can actually get a lot more cash flow in many cases from short-term rentals than you can with long-term rentals. When you average it all out, the net cash flow that you make and you put in your pocket can sometimes be 2 or 3 times or more than you would if you used a long-term rental. That's the upside. The downside of a short-term rental is that you also have to invest more time and energy in the management and the systems of basically what's a hospitality business. You can think about it like almost like a hotel that's in a small property. So you have to be willing to do that, or willing to pay somebody to do that, or partner with someone else to do that. That's kind of your cost of entry in running Airbnb or short-term rental properties. I've seen a lot of people get into the business thinking that was exciting, and then they kind of get worn down and just don't really build systems to help them run the business. And that's really the right way to think about this. This is a piece of real estate that you can own or control, but you're running a business on top of it. So you just got to be prepared to do that. The other downside is there's some risk in certain cities. It's become so popular that there are people and leaders in certain cities and states regulating against short-term rentals. So you really have to be careful on the types of properties you buy, making sure you understand the zoning, making sure you understand the regulations. For example, I bought a short-term rental property with a partner in Kalispell, Montana, and our building is in a commercial zone. So it's zoned for hotels or other commercial properties. So we're grandfathered in. We don't have the risk of buying a single family house in a neighborhood, turning it into a short-term rental, and then having the local city council, overturn that and say, nope, if you're in a single family subdivision, you can't do Airbnb or short-term rentals. That's the risk that a lot of people have taken, and it's been a downside for them because if you can't rent it in short-term rental, then you have to switch back to long-term rental, and the property might be upside down. It might not make sense for that. So again, a good niche strategy that works really well, increases cash flow. I found that you just have to know for yourself if you're attracted to the hospitality business. Are you someone who likes, welcoming people and having guests and really the little small touches, writing handwritten notes and being, the person who welcomes them in personally? If you like that, then this could be a good fit. And I've seen some of the fastest journeys to financial freedom using a mix of short-term rentals and long-term rentals. They might have 2 or 3 short-term rentals to make some cash flow to kind of get out of one of their jobs or both of their jobs. And then they have some long-term rentals for other long-term wealth building. And that little mix can make you get to financial freedom. I've also seen other people who just specialize only in short-term rentals, and they really went all in on it so that they can then partner with other people. Other people come up with the money, and then they manage the property and make cash flow that way. I've also seen people doing what's called co-hosting, where instead of you owning a property, you could just have somebody else own it, and you could share in the cash flow by you being the manager of the property. So a lot of different ways to make particularly cash flow, but also wealth building with the short-term rental strategy. You just really got to study it and know what you're doing. Strategy number 9 is the midterm rental. Now, unlike the short-term rental, which is 30 days or less as your tenant staying there, a midterm rental typically has a tenant who stays between 30 days and maybe up to 6 months. So it's in between the short-term rental and the long-term rental. But it has some qualities of the short-term rental in that you can often get higher cash flow on a midterm rental than you would on a long-term rental. The downside, though, is that you have to furnish the property like short-term rental, so there's some upfront cost to that. And you also have to deal with this potential vacancy. So it's a longer stay than a short-term rental, so there's a little bit more stability. But if somebody moves out after 3, 4, 5 months, then you might have a month or 2 or 3 still looking for another tenant. So that could be one of the downsides, is getting in the rhythm of finding your tenants. And a final downside, I would say, is that you just have a smaller pool of potential tenants. This is kind of a niche strategy. So whereas long-term rentals, there are a lot of different people who have different reasons for wanting to stay in a property for 1, 2, 3 years. With a midterm rental, you're typically looking for people like traveling nurses, maybe a grad student, like a resident in a medical program who's just trying to go from one place to another for a few months at a time. Maybe it's someone who's in between building houses and they're just looking for a spot. Now, if you find the right location and you find the right supply of tenants from different sources, you could keep your property consistently full. And that's how you make midterm rentals work. But I've seen some people not be as strategic about that, or maybe they're in the wrong location, the wrong type of property. And if you can't just wave your magic wand and all of a sudden it works, you really have to position the property well with the furnishings and the location in order to make it work well as a midterm rental. So like all of these strategies, one of the reasons I put this in the intermediate, the wealth builder strategy, is you got to do your homework. You got to study this. You got to read books. You got to maybe take a course or 2 on this in order to get good at and copy other people who are making this work well. But if you do it, it could be another good strategy to have some cash flow, plus some wealth building at the same time. Strategy number 10 is the co-living or the rent by the room strategy. So instead of doing a normal rental where you rent to one person or one family and they lease the entire property, in this strategy, you split up the property. So let's say we had a 4-bedroom house with a bonus room. Maybe you convert that bonus room into another bedroom and you put a closet in there and you would rent out each of those bedrooms. So all 5 of the bedrooms to 5 separate people. You have a separate lease with each of them and then they share the common area. Now, the big benefit of this is the increase in cash flow that you can potentially get with this strategy. And I'll just give you an example. In my area, that 4-bedroom house that I just gave you an example of, maybe that would rent for $2,000 per month. But then if you rented by the bedroom, maybe you could get $600 or more. So 600 times 5 would be $3,000 per month. So potentially, at least on paper, you'd be able to get $1,000 per month more in cash flow. So that if that's the upside, the downside is that this is more management intensive. So as you might imagine, if you have 6 people, some of those people might be leaving pretty regularly. So you're pretty often going to be leasing the property. Whereas if you have a long-term tenant, they might stay for a year, 2, 3, 4, and you wouldn't have to lease it every single year. So you're spend a lot of time and energy leasing. You also might have conflicts between tenants. I'm not saying that's always going to happen, but you might have just roommate issues and you have to get in the middle of that, or at least have to have rules around that to help control those situations. Another issue is that similar to short-term rentals, this can become pretty unpopular, especially in residential neighborhoods. There's this concept called NIMBYs, not in my backyard. Everybody wants to have affordable housing, but people don't want to have affordable housing next door to them. So if you have multiple cars in the driveway, if you have a lot of people living in a house, it's going to often attract the attention of neighbors and neighborhoods, and there'll be complaints and there'll be pressure to not allow that with the zoning. And in many cases, it's already not allowed. So in my town in Clemson, South Carolina, I'm in a college town. And so rent by the room has been pretty common for many, many years in college towns. But in Clemson, they regulate it so you can only have 2 people who are unrelated living in one house. So even if you have 6 bedrooms, you can only have 2 people who aren't related living there. So a family of 6 or 7 would be fine, but you can't have 5 or 6 roommates living in that one house because there's a regulation that says you can't. So there's a regulation risk either currently or maybe in the future that certain cities might not like that. And so you have to pick that carefully. You got to understand the wins of regulations and which towns are friendly to that and really want more affordable housing in this form and which ones are not. And the one other challenge I would say is that the ideal co-living or rent by the room property might not be the ideal regular house that you're going to sell. So for example, if you're chopping up the house into a bunch of bedrooms, the ideal co-living house might have like 7 bedrooms. But when you sell a regular house or rent a regular house, having it chopped up that much is not going to be ideal. So what I have seen is a lot of the ideal co-living houses are very niche. They just fit for that strategy. And if you wanted to switch strategies and have a plan B or a plan C, you're not going to be able to do that as easily, or at least it's going to cost you some money to undo the improvements and the chopping up that you did before. So not a deal breaker, but just something to be aware of as well. Strategy number 11 is the Section 8 or government subsidized rent strategy. And the way this works is that your tenants in this strategy receive some or all of their rent through the federal or local government through a voucher or a credit system. And so the benefit of this, I see a couple of big benefits. Number one is that the person paying you most of the rent is a government agency and they have big resources and they can pay that rent on time. It just gets auto deposited to your bank account every single month. So that's a benefit. The second benefit, which is not talked about as much, is you could potentially get really long-term tenants with this strategy. So if you find a tenant who qualifies to rent your place and they have this voucher from the government, they probably had to work pretty hard to find your place because not all landlords are willing to rent Section 8. And so if they like the place, if you like them, and the government's paying most of their rent, they will stay there a long time. And you can have a tenant who stays for 4 or 5, maybe even 10 years or more. At least that's what I found from some of the Section 8 investors I know. So as with everything, there's a couple of downsides here. And one of those is there's an additional red tape that you have to go through in order to get the benefit of that government rent. You have some red tape through inspections and through applications you have to do. And I believe in Section 8, you probably have a once a year inspection that happens. And so if you keep your property up and you know what is on that checklist, it's probably not that big a deal, but that is a time and a management hassle that you have to go through in order to do that. Another downside, which has happened more recently, is there also could be some political risk because this is funded through the federal government typically. specifically. And if there are changes in the political parties about what's a priority and what's not a priority, this could be reduced in funding or not funded at all. Now, the likelihood of that happening, I think, is pretty low, but you do have to pay attention to these things and understand that the source of the money and the stability of this rental strategy comes from federal subsidies. So you just got to pay attention to that and make sure that's a good long-term strategy for you. Strategy number 12 is something I'm going to call the small land development strategy. This is really very similar to the BRRRR strategy or the value add strategy. The variation I want to give to you, though, is that in this case, instead of fixing up a property that's just like a traditional fixer-upper, you're adding value by changing and subdividing the land and adding another property on to that same land that you have. Now, I'm going to give you a couple examples of how you can do this. One that I have done recently, we bought a property that had an older house. It was a major fixer-upper house on the property, but it had a bonus lot, an extra lot that came with it. And by studying the zoning, we saw that we could actually divide this property and still be within the regulations of the city into 3 properties. So 3 separate lots. Now, one of the lot lines that we wanted to build was going right through this old house. And when we looked at this old house, it would cost about $100,000 or more to fix it up. And we decided just to tear the house down and have 3 buildable lots that we're now going to build 3 new construction properties on. So this is called build to rent on these existing lots we have. So we went from what was 2 lots with an existing house to having 3 lots with 3 new construction houses. That is an example of a small land development subdivision. And the end result of that is we will have new houses that we probably have 20 to 30% equity in, meaning if they're worth $350, we might have, $275 or $250 in it. Depends on what our final cost will be. And so we're going to have equity in the property, hopefully a little bit of cash flow, but we're in a good location where these properties exist. So that's one example. Another example of this strategy would be what's called an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit. And this is really popular, especially I've seen in California and other urban areas where you have regulations in cities and states that allow you to add another unit, to add a guest house essentially on the property. And you have to study the regulations and the zoning and what's allowed and what the setbacks are. But if you can do that, you can often build that small property and then rent that out and have a positive cash flow on the accessory dwelling unit. So you can have a rental on the existing property and then a rental on the accessory dwelling unit. So you've essentially turned your property into a duplex in what was before a single family house. So these are both ways to increase the density of the property to get more rent from the existing one. And really the unlock of this is the zoning. And that's also the downside. You've got to study your zoning, study your land regulation developments. It's a little bit less intuitive than just a regular old fixer-upper, but once you unlock it, once you learn it, it can open up a ton of opportunities. And this is a strategy I'm definitely using a lot myself. So let's pause and take a breath here. We have been through 5 starter strategies and 7 wealth building strategies. And remember, if you want to download a workbook page so you can follow along and review each of these strategies in detail, you can go to coachcarson.com/strategies. You can also see a link in the YouTube and the podcast description below. But what I want to transition to now are the harvester strategies. So at least in my opinion, the strategies I'm about to share with you are ones that are better for people who have already built some wealth and they're ready to harvest some of that wealth, to turn that equity and that wealth into cash flow. And they're ready to kind of live off the cash flow and be in a place where they reduce their risk and enjoy a little bit of the fruits of what they built already. So the first of the harvester strategies and our number 13 strategy overall is something I call the trade up strategy. And it typically involves using a tactic called the 1031 tax-free exchange. Now, I'm going to take a step back to explain what I mean by this, by explaining the problem or the challenge that this is solving. So as a real estate investor, when you first buy a property, let's say you put $50,000 down and you figure out that you had a 6% cash on cash return. That might be pretty typical on a multifamily or a kind of cash flow centric property today. And so you were happy with that return today, and you also are happy with the growth that you hope this property will give you over time. And then you hold that property, let's say for 10 or 15 years, and your equity grows and grows and grows. What often happens as you pay your loan down, as the price of the property goes up in value, and your cash flow doesn't keep up with the equity growth that you have. And so your return on the total equity you have in the property, your down payment was your equity in the beginning, but now the equity has grown over time. Your return on that equity goes down and down and down. So it maybe started as a 5 or 6% return in the beginning. Maybe it's more like 2 or 3% in the end. And that might be an extreme version, but in many places I've seen students have properties in California and Austin, Texas, and New York, for example, That's not unheard of that you would have a really low return on your equity. So the opportunity is you have a big chunk of equity. Let's say over multiple properties, you have $1 million in equity that's getting 2 or 3% return, and a 3% return on $1 million, if we just look at it from a cash flow standpoint, would be $30,000 per year. But let's say you wanted to optimize that a little bit more and make even more cash flow to actually live off of. Maybe you could find a replacement property. So you sell this property, use the 1031 exchange process, and make sure you follow all the rules. And there's an intermediary, and you'll need to study how that works. But if you could find a replacement property for that and sell it and then replace your equity into this new property, and let's say that makes a 6% return on your equity, you could go from a $30,000 per year to a $60,000 per year cash flow, which might help you meet your goals. Or maybe you can do even better than that. Maybe you can get a 10% return and get a $100,000 per year. And so that would be the reason to trade up, is to optimize your equity for cash flow. Maybe also if you're wanting to continue growing, you could also use a little bit more leverage and continue growing there. But the main point is, for harvesters, you're trying to get to a point where you can, squeeze the most you can out of the existing equity and wealth that you built. So that is the benefit of the strategy. The downside is, let's just be honest, doing 1031 exchanges are difficult. There's a timetable. You have to identify the replacement properties within 90 days of the time that you sell your property, and you have to close on it within 180 days. And that time frame, that clock ticking, often makes investors make bad decisions. So they're trying to save money on taxes, and they end up buying a property that's not as high quality as what they already had in the first place. So they might have been better off keeping this higher quality, high equity property, and they end up with something that on paper makes better cash flow, but maybe it's in a bad location, bad management. And so people make a lot of mistakes in this transition. Like executing a 1031 exchange isn't always simple. So you got to be really thoughtful about that. Know yourself, know whether it's worth you taking on the challenge of doing that. But if you can make that happen, it can be a really amazing tool to optimize your equity better, make more cash flow, and end up as a harvester in a better place. The 14th strategy is private lending or private notes. And this is another one I like a lot in the harvester phase. And this is one I personally used a lot. And the way I would explain it, this is either you loaning money to other investors. So instead of you being the person who owns the property yourself, you're loaning money to other people who own the property, typically investors, or you're doing something where you're turning a renter, so one of your rental properties, into an owner financing contract. So the person who lives there, the renter, you could help them become a homeowner by them paying a down payment to you, and then you becoming like the bank by them making interest and principal payments to you. Now, the big benefit of this is that compared to rental properties, I just talked about in the last strategy, having equity in a property, and you often have low return on equity with a rental property. You might have growth and stability, but you might have low return on equity. With a note or with owner financing, you can often get much higher cash returns on your equity. So in my experience, anywhere from 7% on the low end on a very safe deal for me, up to 12%, even higher cash on cash returns. So that is the big benefit. And that's one of the reasons I've mixed notes with rental properties over my portfolio. So using notes more for the cash flow side of things, using rentals for the stable long-term cash flow and growth as well. And so this is the reason you might get into that, is that increased cash flow. The downside, though, is that you don't own the property. So if you're loaning money to somebody else, eventually they're going to pay you off. So especially if you're loaning at higher interest rates, their incentive is not to keep paying you at a 10 or 12% interest rate. It's more of a gap funding, short-term loan. And so you often get paid off and you got to find another loan. But if you can keep it working, if you can keep loaning money to other investors, it is a reasonable strategy to keep getting that higher return. The other downside is this is sort of a separate business. And so you got to learn the business, the paperwork, the legal contracts. You got to get with your local real estate attorney to understand how foreclosures work and what happens in a worst case scenario if they stop paying you. So whether it's an investor or whether it's your tenant who you've financed the property to, if they stop paying you, the worst case scenario is you have to take that property back. So you want to make sure you've got good title insurance. You want to make sure you've covered all the bases in terms of your legal paperwork so that if you had to foreclose, you could. And at least for me personally, someone who owns rental properties, my main criteria before I loan money or finance a house to somebody is, in a worst case scenario, would I be happy taking that property back? I don't want to have a note on a property that I wouldn't be okay owning, or at a price that I wouldn't be okay owning. So typically I want to loan at a lower loan to value value or have a lot more equity in the property. But if you can do all that, you can create some safety, some margin of safety, and still get a high cash return. So this is a reason I like this strategy a lot. There's some things to learn. There's some things you got to study and get into. But if you're a harvester, especially, and maybe if you're using your self-directed retirement account, it's a whole nother story where if you have some wealth built up in your retirement account, you could self-direct it and maybe do some lending out of that as well. So something to look into for those of you in that situation. Strategy number 15 is one that would make old Dave Ramsey happy, and is to pay off debt on your rental properties, either some of your debt or all of the debt on your rental portfolio. Now, this is one of those topics that can get a little controversial in the real estate investing space. On one extreme, there's people who say they never want to pay off debt. I saw a video one time with Robert Kiyosaki saying that even with the hundreds of millions of dollars in net worth or whatever he has, he's still borrowing more money. Okay, good for him. But there's people on the other end who say, you know what, I'm a harvester now, and I want to start optimizing not only for return on investment, but for peace of mind, for being able to sleep well at night, for having a reduced return on brain damage, as one of my friends likes to say. So you want to have a more stable, safe portfolio that also produces cash flow. And I found no better way than paying off debt to do that. And I have a family member, for example, when they were ready to retire, they owned a lot of properties. They owned a lot of rental properties and some land. And instead of just keeping all of those same properties, they chose to use a strategy I like a lot called pruning your portfolio. So think about like you're in the backyard and you have fruit trees, and a healthy fruit tree, you have to cut back some of the branches. So if you cut back some of the branches, the overall tree gets healthier. And I see that same thing happening with the harvester portfolio. You prune off some properties by selling some of your properties. And these might be the properties that are less than ideal as a rental. Maybe it's one that is like too big for a rental. Maybe the maintenance is kind of a headache. Maybe it's not attracting as good a tenants. Or maybe you just have some raw land or some development land you want to sell. And my family member, that's basically what they did. They sold some land, they got that money out of the land, and then they used that money to pay off the debt on their rental properties. And now they own the properties free and clear, and it's very low risk, it's very stable, and they have that cash flow coming in, and they still own the rental properties. So they still have, as rents go up, they'll still benefit from the inflation and the appreciation of the rents, but it's a much, much more higher peace of mind portfolio than they had before. So one strategy to pay off debt, selling your excess property, or maybe just buying more properties than you need, selling some of the extras, pruning your portfolio. The other way to do it, you could combine it, and I've done both of these, by the way, personally in my portfolio, is doing a rental debt snowball. So if you've listened to Dave Ramsey or any other personal finance folks out there, they talk about when you want to pay your credit cards off, you kind of make a list of all your credit card debts and you start paying them off, either by the lowest amount you have, like the lowest principal amount, all the way to the highest, or maybe highest interest rate first. You can choose which one works better for you. But you can do the same thing with rental properties. And the idea is, instead of putting all your properties on a 15-year loan, put them all on a 30-year loan, or the longest period you can get, and then take all of your extra cash flow when you're ready to start paying off the debt and concentrate it on one rental property at a time. And instead of a 30-year loan, you can pay that property off in 2, 3, 4 years by making extra big payments on that. And then once that property is paid off, you have the extra cash flow freed up from that one to go on the second one and the third one. And you can choose how many properties you want to pay off. I'm personally not paying off all of our properties. We still have some debt. But the goal here is, instead of having 70, 80% loan to value, you're trying to get down to a more stable long-term portfolio of maybe 20% or 15%, and you have higher cash flow and a lot less risk, so you can sleep better at night. The final harvester strategy number 16, is to be a limited partner in other people's deals. Now, what this means is you're essentially the money partner for other people. So you have other people who are going out and finding the deal and managing it. Let's call them the entrepreneur, and then they need somebody to put up the money. Maybe they've run out of money. Maybe they've got, all their money in their other deals. And so you could provide value to them by putting up the cash they need, maybe the down payment and the fix up money. And then together you form a partnership, and you're the limited partner, they're the general partner. And then you own the property together, and you can benefit and split up the benefits of that property together. Now, this happens in a couple ways. The way I like it as a small and mighty investor is to work directly with the other investor and have this small partnership, just me and that other entity. That kind of keeps things simpler. And I've done some deals like that. The 8-unit building that I bought in Kalispell, Montana, that was a short-term rental that I talked about earlier. That was more the arrangement we had, and we just have an LLC together on that property. But there's also bigger limited partnership deals. They call those syndications, where maybe the property is just too big for one limited partner to take down, and so that maybe they need to attract $20 million worth of investment capital or $50 million worth of investment capital. And so that they go and invest with multiple limited partners. And so you can also try to invest in those those types of syndications. Now, that to be a syndicator or a limited partner in those syndications, you often need to have an accreditation or you need to be an accredited investor. So you have to meet some thresholds of either income or net worth in order to qualify to be able to do that. That's why I think this is more of a harvester strategy. But I'll also say even beyond those requirements, it can be more difficult to evaluate those deals. So you really have to vet very carefully any of these syndication deals. There are some of these that can go very bad and you can lose 100% of your money. So there's a real risk to that. And the way you try to reduce that risk is something I'm still learning for myself. I'm not an expert on this, but number one, you have to vet the person who's putting that deal together. Your trust is in that person. They control the deal, and ultimately your destiny and the return on investment depends on them. And so you not only have to vet them, you got to vet the deal. You got to read these huge thick paperwork that their attorney drew up that tells you all the risks you're taking and all the risks that they're not taking. So you have to be careful with those. Study them carefully. It's a more advanced strategy. But if it goes well, if you find the right person, if you find the right properties, it can be a way to be very passive and still benefit from these other investments that other people are making. Do you remember at the beginning of the episode, I said my goal is to help you find clarity with your real estate investing strategy. Find one or two strategies that make the most sense for you. So I want to help you put all of this information together. We've just gone over in these 16 strategies to help you find the right fit for you. And that comes in 3 different steps. The first step is to ask yourself, and this would be a good time to pause and think about it, or if you're on the road, pause it and think about it while you're driving. Ask yourself which of those 3 stages makes the most sense for you or you identify with right now. Is it a starter where you're trying to find your first deal or two and just get your feet wet? Is it the builder phase where you know you need to grow your net worth, you don't have enough wealth yet, and you're trying to really grow? Or is it stage number 3 where you're a harvester, where either you have enough wealth and you're trying to live off that wealth or have cash flow, or maybe you're in an intermediate step where you just want to take a break for a little bit. You want to take some chips off the table and you want to do kind of a mini harvester phase. Ask yourself, step number 1, which one of those 3 do you identify with the most? And then step number 2 is to go back and look at the list. And you can download this list at coachcarson.com/strategies. So look at it, print it off perhaps, and just take your notes and say which one of these strategies, or maybe at most 2 strategies, makes the most sense for me. And I'll give you some clues on how you can start identifying that. Number 1, is there one that just sounds fun to you? Maybe you want to flip houses. Maybe you're someone who really wants to fix up properties and add value, get your hands dirty. That's just interesting to you. Maybe you really think you're into hospitality and that's a way that you can get into the short-term rental business. Whatever it is, ask yourself, which one of these is fun? Which one of these matches my skill set? Which one of these do I already have some skills or some interest in? Hopefully 1 or maybe 2 will rise to the top. Circle those on the list. That's the strategy you should focus on and exclude the other ones. Ignore the other ones for now because you can always come back to them later. But if you want to make the most progress as a real estate investor, you got to focus on 1. And then step number 3 is to study and master that one strategy. I have a program where I coach and teach people called Rental Property Mastery, where they join for a year or more and they stick around and they study and they go deep on topics in real estate investing. That's the kind of commitment you have to a strategy. This isn't a passive strategy where you just invest in the entire market. You actually have to get good at it. You have to have a competitive advantage. And your competitive advantage is the knowledge and the skills that you have. So once you've taken step 1 and 2, you've chosen a strategy, start studying it. Watch my videos on that strategy or watch other people's videos. Take a course, read a book, have an education on this business. Take it seriously, become a professional in a short period of time on the one strategy that you've chosen. If you already have an idea on what the strategy is, I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Let me know whether this was helpful. Let me know what strategy you're leaning towards. And if you like this idea of me giving you an overview of the business and helping you get clarity, I think you'll like my next video, which is called How to Achieve Financial Freedom with 5 Small and Simple Rental Properties. I have an approach to real estate investing called the Small and Mighty Investor Approach. And I want to show you how just 5 properties can produce a large amount of cash flow and keep it super, super simple to give you a long-term goal that you can shoot for. So check that out. There'll be a link to a thumbnail above me here, or you can click on the link to the video or the episode in the podcast or the YouTube description below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next episode.